Hello, welcome to Lecture 9. In Lecture 9, we are going to be talking about research ethics. So, what do we know? What do we understand about ethics? We all understand that in order to identify ethical issues in research, we have to be in the shoes of the participant. So think about how we might feel if we are asked certain questions, or if we're observed by somebody doing something that we don't expect to be observed, or if documents pertinent to us were revealed or examined. How do we feel about people handling our own information? And how do we want them to deal with it, right? Universities and institutions typically have a body called a Research and Ethics Board. Um, their objective is to look at research projects and determine if ethical principles are adhered to, and this must be demonstrated in the application. So a question then arises, well, if we all understand what ethical conduct means, or we all have a sense for what it is, why do we need a monitoring body? Why do we need a research ethics board at a university? Remember that as individuals, we all have different understanding of what propriety is, what is appropriate, and what's ethical. We all act differently based on what we perceive to be right or wrong. That's why we need a set of guidelines, a central document, so to speak, to determine what is ethical in terms of how we conduct ourselves with other people when we conduct research with them as participants. So there are several ethical principles, and Chapter 9 goes into great detail, and we will go into some detail in this lecture as well. Ethical principles require that participants have enough information to give an informed consent. Their identity must be protected unless they have authorized release of some information in writing. And participants cannot be coerced or bribed into divulging information. Data must also be stored that's collected from these participants in secure locations or circumstances. And this is not just to protect anonymity or confidentiality, but this is also to prevent allegations of forgery. The objective of this lecture is meant to prepare you to be able to submit a research ethics application. It's always a good idea to get a copy of the Research Ethics Board or Research Ethics Committee, or however it's referred to. Each institution has their own set of guidelines. It's a good idea to get a copy of that for yourself to understand what principles you are expected to adhere to. So, research in the social sciences usually involves dealing with people, organizations, and groups. Unless we are dealing with secondary data, and if you remember what secondary data is, this is data that's already been collected, so public records or census data, public documents. If you aren't dealing with these, you're going to be asking people questions, or you might be observing their behavior, or you might be collecting other information about them or from them, or both. All of our dealings with other people raise ethical issues. Like I said previously, we all understand some ethical issues in our personal lives, issues of loyalty, of honesty, of integrity. However, because individual understandings of each of these broad concepts are somewhat different, and there might not be a perfect overlap, there has to be something put down formally. More recently, businesses are also starting to ask, is my business ethical? And when they identify an ethical angle of their business, they don't fail to promote it. And that's a good thing. Anyway, it goes without saying that ethical issues exist in research. The background of ethics is also very interesting. Uh, Unethical events have been occurring with humans without consent for the longest time and with coercion. And a relatively recent example is the use of prisoners to conduct experiments in Nazi Germany. Uh, Even more recently, there are allegations that in certain oppressive regimes in different parts of the world, political prisoners are often used to experiment on. So, amongst the ethics of research, the first thing is to be considerate. We have to always think about how we would react if we were being studied. How would we respond to a question that we are planning to ask? Okay, so being considerate is important of people's feelings. Gratitude is also expressing our gratitude, being grateful is also our being considerate with our participants, because people are doing us a favor with their time. They're being thoughtful. They're making an effort for us, uh, usually for no personal gain. So we have to be grateful, and that's part of being considerate. Being considerate is also being prepared. This is, from the researcher's point of view, being respectful of people's time and availability. So to have an interview with 200 questions, or a questionnaire with 200 questions, or a poorly prepared questionnaire with bad or offensive questions, that's completely inconsiderate, and that's unethical. Interview processes, questionnaires, to some extent, are an invasion of privacy. So if we aren't considerate, um, participants might refuse to cooperate, or they might, if they suspect that their data is not going to be secure, they might provide misleading information. Just think about how many times we enter false emails on corporate websites so as to access a resource, but we don't want dissemination of our information, so we put in an email that's not necessarily the one that we use. So it's the same exact thing. If people aren't comfortable with where or how their information is being held, they might either refuse to cooperate or provide misleading information. Um, so the objective is to be respectful and give them a sense that their privacy is being respected. Seeking permission is also another sign of being considerate. We have to be careful how we seek permission. Um, it's not always essential that we tell them exactly what we're investigating, particularly if telling them will compromise the way they respond. For example, if you are administering an attitudinal survey, let's say on racism or sexism, perhaps not best to tell the participants that this is what we're measuring, because then the participants will not answer as they normally would, and they will try to find the answer that closely approximates that of a person who is seen in a positive light, right? So it's a good idea to tell them that you're collecting data for an experiment and give them a sense for it, but not necessarily reveal anything in some cases. In some situations, it's absolutely fine to reveal what is expected to be achieved, because in that situation, the data will not compromise the research process. An important part of interacting with participants is having a consent form. There's an example of a consent form in your textbook, and similar consent forms are found on University Research Ethics Board websites. They come in a standard template, but they usually have a few different things on them. It's usually signed by both the researcher, which could be you, the student researcher, your professor, It'll also have contact information. Typically, the contact information tends to have the professor's name to get more details about the research, but also the Research Ethics Board chair. And if you are wondering what the Research Ethics Board chair, why their information must be present, oftentimes participants might want to withdraw from a research process or from providing data or having their data used, and they might not want to contact the professor or the student directly in order to either prevent awkwardness or, in order to prevent awkwardness, or perhaps even to simply maintain their anonymity from the professor while they're withdrawing their data. Okay, so that's why the REB's contact information, chair's contact information, is also there in order to report any form of malpractice or veering from the consent letter itself that the participants have consented to. Okay, so it's for all of these reasons that the REB chair's information is also usually present on a consent letter. The consent form is also important because the consent form is typically a letter to a potential participant written in very simple language. So it will require the researcher, both the student researcher and the professor, to be able to articulate their research in simple words and make it very clear. Typically, it will not have acronyms and detailed methodologies for experiments and so on. The consent form identifies the researcher, so if there's a student researcher, then it identifies a student. And it also identifies a PI, which is the principal investigator. That's the professor. So go ahead, look at your textbook, and take a look at the consent form and see what all it has. Then go on to Laurentian University's website, or if you're a gerontology student, you can go to Huntington University's website. You can click on the research ethics application form, which might have a template of a consent letter as well. Here's an example of what a consent letter of one of my former students. I'm just going to color out the name because that's not necessarily important, but this is an information letter with the consent portion. This is the consent portion at the bottom. So the student communicates to the potential participants as to the purpose of the study and talks to them about the potential benefits. So these are all important things that must be in the consent letter. It must communicate if there are any benefits to the participants, any harms to the participants. So in this case, the benefits are minimal to the participants themselves, but there might be a broader benefit because of the study itself. And it tells them what to expect in the survey. There's a 10-minute survey via telephone, and the responses will be on a 5-point Likert scale. They're also informed that they have a right to withdraw from the study at any point prior to publication, and they can choose to decline to answer any question. They're also told where the information will be stored, after which it will be destroyed, and the results are the participants are also informed as to where the results will be available. In this case, it says an undergraduate thesis. Now, in this part is the consent part where you have the person's name, so they go ahead and they say John Doe, Quintes, and they go ahead and sign, and they date it. And once the participant gets this letter back, or a copy of it back, they can go ahead and consider that participant as an okay candidate to use for their study. There's a formal ethical review process, and the reason there is a formal ethical process is because being considerate is not good enough. And we spoke about why, even though we all think we're ethical, we're considerate, it's not quite enough. It has to abide by a course of ethics. So most universities accept and use funding from the Tri-Council. The Tri-Council is the National Science and Energy Research Council, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. These are the three big research councils in Canada. They hold public funds to redisperse as grant funding in order to do research. Because they hold as much clout as they do, the three councils have come upon a common statement called the Tri-Council Policy Statement. So there's a code of ethics found in the TCPS. And this code of ethics forms the guideline for all universities to create their ethics policies and for the research and ethics boards to function within. So any researcher at a university conducting research with human subjects, or human participants rather, we don't call them subjects anymore, so if you are used to reading subjects, the politically correct term, and it is true, people are participating, they're not subjected to it, so the term is participants. Anyway, so the Tri-Council Policy Statement, they have ethical guidelines, and it's a centralized document. It creates a uniform ethics policy for research, and it sets the highest common standard for governing academic or learned research done through any of these funding agencies. So if you were to do a research project at Laurentian, your proposal must meet ethical guidelines of TCPS. Since all Canadian universities adopt it, one of the requirements is, it's called CORE. CORE is an acronym. It's Common Research Ethics. The thing is, the Tri-Council not only has guidelines for research ethics, they're not a big secret. CORE stands for Course of Research Ethics. So the CORE course is an online course which goes through all the guidelines and details so that researchers can design their projects ethically. But what it does is it has many scenarios that researchers can go through depending upon their field of research. It also has little quizzes throughout the course itself. So as you go through the course, you take all these quizzes. Even if you fail them, you can take them a second time or a third time or how many ever times it takes. But by the time people are usually done successfully completing the course, most viewers will have a pretty good sense of what the minimum ethical standards are that one must adhere to when doing a research project. The course takes about 4 to 6 hours to complete. It does a comprehensive job in testing prospective researchers' understanding of ethics. The reason TCPS was created is that, as you can imagine, much like the Nazi experiments on human, I would have to say prisoners or slave labor, overzealous researchers and medical scientists have done a lot of unsanctioned research without taking into account participant consent, participant willingness, and caused a lot of pain and suffering as a result of their unethical experimentation. In your study guide, there is a recommendation for a film that I like students to view it, but I do offer a strong disclaimer saying some of the content is rather harsh. So the film is called The Stanford Prison Experiment. I believe it was remastered or recreated in 2015. It's no longer available on Netflix, but you can get it on Apple Pay, perhaps Amazon Prime, or a few other providers. YouTube also has it, so you can purchase it on YouTube. It's officially being sold on YouTube for I think $3.99 or something like that. Before you view the film, at least read something about the film. So if you are likely to get severely upset or emotionally disturbed or have challenges, then I would recommend that you just read the description of the film and not view the film itself. The documentary is very useful in understanding not just what ethical violations do, but the extent of ethical violations and the kind of damage they cause. And this was by a scientist who intended to understand what a prison environment does to normal young people, right? So it was the intentions were not necessarily as malicious as the results turned out to be. Anyway, so if you get an opportunity, this is a good documentary to view, but again, make sure that this is something that will work for you. Okay? Don't view. It's not a requirement that you view the documentary. It is a good idea because there's a lot of fast learning in terms of ethical violations that you can get out of the documentary. Getting back to the TCPS, the TCPS takes a lot, the Tri-Council policy statement and the course on research ethics. They train you on a lot of different things, but they take into account basically the Canadian Charter on Rights and Freedoms. They, consider FIPA, which is, your privacy protection, like physician records, bank statements, etc. So there are 5 principles of research ethics. Researchers must treat with dignity and respect persons, groups, and organizations that participate in the research, because you may not be interviewing just an individual, you may be interviewing a group, you may have focus groups. So what that means is there has to be respect for human dignity. Researchers must maintain the physical, social, religious, familial, community, linguistic, and cultural integrity of all participants. So that's how you respect human dignity. It's not just saying I respect you. You have to respect physical, social, so there are a lot of things that must be respected in respecting human dignity. We have to respect free and informed consent, which means participants must be fully informed. What's the purpose of the study? What are the intended results? There must be no coercion. You can't beg, plead. Oh, if you don't participate in my study, I won't get data and I can't complete my thesis. Oh, please do it. You can't beg or plead. There should be no coercion of any sort. Also remember, the word consent is important. Consent is an ongoing process. If people have said, yes, I acquiesce to your interview, I agree to your interview, and you interview them, and somehow by the end of the interview they feel that I'm very uncomfortable with this information going out. They can withdraw. They have the right to withdraw. And they have the right to withdraw that at any time. Obviously, once the data is published with their consent, it's harder to retract that information at that time. So it's quite reasonable that prior to publication or making that data publicly available, consent can be withdrawn. Respect for vulnerable persons is very important. What that means is we have to understand that autonomy in mentally disabled or cognitively challenged people, it's not reasonable to ask vulnerable people, and there can be different kinds of vulnerable people. It's not limited to mentally disabled or cognitively challenged people. It could be extremely old adults or in poor health who may not have the wherewithal to understand what's going on. So anytime people are having issues making rational decisions, the consent must be using a caregiver. Part of treating with dignity and respect is respect for privacy and confidentiality. So if any data is being made publicly available, the data should ideally be de-identified or anonymized. Storage must be secure. So if it's a computer file, it must have a passcode or some kind of a security feature so it can't just be accessed. And the storage, if it's paper or tapes or whatever it is, it must be stored in a locked cabinet in a secure place. There must be respect for justice and inclusiveness. So research with human beings has a long history of exclusion on the basis of religion, race, ethnicity. So if you look at a lot of the human research in the United States since World War II, a lot of the research was simply done by white people on white populations. Some minimal research was done on people of other origins, even though the United States has had several populations, several ethnic groups for a long time. There was a significant Chinese population, there was a significant African population, but research was primarily done a certain way. In Canada, the people to be first excluded were essentially First Nation people and Métis. So when we talk about respect for justice and inclusiveness, what we're saying is we should not unfairly exclude any population or burden them with participation, just for the sake of having them be researched a certain way. Now, in principle, a research ethics board, when looking at the first principle of dignity and respect, will often investigate whether the research project has the potential to cause harm and what's the benefit of the research project. Some research projects have the potential to cause a limited amount of harm or damage, but the benefit out of that research project to the broader community might be so great that a research ethics board will allow it. The other thing is when requesting people to participate, because of the need for free and informed consent, which is right here, consent can be influenced. So let me give you an example. If this were a classroom situation and if I were a professor and I needed a sudden sample or an accidental sample, which you remember from the previous lecture, and I decided to use the students in my classroom. Now, if I told the students, hello everybody, I'm conducting a research experiment and I'm very interested in seeing the data on how many hours of sleep you get and how it correlates with your overall university mark. How many of you are you willing to participate? Please show me by the raise of your hands. Think about that situation. There is a power differential that exists between the professors, such as myself, and their students. And now I'm asking students to tell me if they consent to participate in a study that I'm performing, knowing fully well that there is the potential for me to influence their final mark. So such a situation, it does not allow for free and informed consent, because the students might be informed, but they're not free to consent. They're not free to withdraw from the study either. Right? That's one way to influence consent. Another way to influence consent is, let's say I want to conduct an experiment or a research project involving students in a different program, say, let's say geography. While I have no power over the students in geography, what I do is I offer every student participant that comes in and answers a 5-minute questionnaire a $100 gift certificate to Tim Hortons. The reason this is unethical is because I have influenced consent. I've influenced free will. A large sum of money for a student seriously impacts their ability to decide whether to agree or not, and then they're no longer consenting to it out of free will, but they're being influenced in order to go and accept the inducement and then participate in the survey. So when consent letters are handed out or participants are invited, there is some allowance to compensate people fairly for their time and their effort. So, for example, if someone are making a 20-kilometer trip to come and answer your, come and respond to you in a 1-hour interview, it's not unfair to compensate them for the gas they spent and perhaps a $5 or a $10 Tim Hortons card to say thank you for your time, and perhaps you can get yourself a coffee. That's reasonable. What's not reasonable is the two examples that I cited before. The second principle is research must, and this is very important, be based on knowledge of the work of the persons in the area. And must be conducted and supervised by persons qualified to do the work, who have the necessary facilities to ensure the safety of participants. It is unethical, completely unethical, to rush into the field to collect data before doing a thorough lit review. So you have to have a comprehensive literature review before we collect data, because that's how we get the knowledge of what's happening in the field. So we have to know what's being discussed in the field. So we have to know what's known in the area. And as a student researcher, for example, if your research interest was in social determinants of health or nutrition, it's absolutely fair for a professor conversant in those areas to be a supervisor, because chances are they are well versed in the literature in the area. They have a pretty good idea. And your work is likely to be based on gaps in knowledge that exist in the field. However, for example, if you were to conduct research on, let's say, post-traumatic stress disorder for older adults coming from war-torn countries, and you wanted a supervisor such as myself to supervise the project, a research ethics board in principle should not permit that project to go through, because that wouldn't be my area of expertise. Even if we did all the literature review and understood what the gaps in knowledge are, I do not have the skills to supervise such a project. And I also do not have the backup resources to ensure the safety of participants because, as you can imagine, reliving traumas are extremely damaging and harmful for participants. So, poor research design, whether it comes out of poor literature review or not, poor research design is actually unethical. So if you design an experiment poorly without understanding what's been done in the field, uh, that's very unethical because you, at the very least, you waste people's time. Okay. What's worse is because the design is bad, you have data coming out which does not make any sense, so it's misleading. It's GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. Skills needed in social sciences research are usually normal skills, ordinary skills of human interaction. But how you use them in research requires careful supervision, even when, especially when students are doing research. So the choice of topic requires good mentoring, and inexperienced researchers should not pick sensitive areas. So in a sense, my areas of skill are social determinants of health, human nutrition, human genetics, epigenetics, and those areas. So it's completely unethical for me to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, work with research projects associated with dementia patients, and so on. It's also important that the supervisor has skills to support the student research or even their own research if there are any problems. For example, you may uncover problems in your interview that are beyond your ability to resolve. You may, while talking to somebody, you may discover that they are in a spousal abuse situation. You might encounter someone who has suicidal ideation. Now, as a student researcher and sometimes even professors, we don't have the ability to counsel these people. We're not counselors. We're not clinical psychologists. So when picking a project, when picking an area, a research supervisor or a researcher must have access to support resources. And then another ethical question comes into the picture. As a student researcher, if your interviewee has told you something in confidence, perhaps a suicidal ideation or a homicidal ideation or a spousal abuse situation, what do you do with that information? Are you supposed to act upon it? Are you supposed to go to a research ethics board with it? What do you do with that information, especially because it's been told to you in confidence and you have assured the individual that all that information will be kept confidential? The third principle of research ethics is that the potential benefits of a research project must substantially outweigh the potential harm to participants. These issues can be discussed with your supervisor. The Research Ethics Board can also provide input on these issues because that's their task, to go ahead and weigh in on the promised benefits of a project against its potential to harm participants, and also to ensure relevant collection of data. The fourth principle is that participants in research must be able to make a voluntary informed decision to participate. And this is very important. And we speak about consent. So consent is offered as consent forms. The decision to participate must be based on what will be involved in terms of time, in terms of activity, and in terms of topics. What are the risks? Where can they lodge a complaint? And all of this information is seen on a consent form. Consent forms must be plain language statements. And we spoke about this a little bit earlier. So they should have no technical terms. They don't need to have acronyms. When we start to put in stuff that participants don't understand, if we have jargon in there, they may not understand everything that's being said to them. Almost all research ethics boards require written consent, with the exception being that when researching with Aboriginal participants in several Aboriginal communities, participants are suspicious of a written signature. So there are some, there is some flexibility in research ethics boards in terms of how consent is obtained when we research certain communities. Data collected must be stored in secure offices, and consent forms are always stored separately from data files. And the reason consent forms are stored separately from data files is during the process of research itself, it's a good idea to not be able to create a connection of the data with the participant. Part of the process of gaining consent is to make sure that the participant understands that in certain situations they will not have absolute confidentiality. There is a chance that certain quotes, when using certain quotes from participants in research publications, the participants may be identified. Sometimes there are lawsuits pertaining to certain incidents that happen, which may have some of the participants involved, and the results could be subpoenaed if they have a bearing on a court case. So that's why it's a good idea to think about the questions you might ask and how you might deal with the fallout. But it's also good to advise the participants that it's extremely confidential, rather than saying it's going to be completely anonymous. And so it's about managing expectations. There are circumstances when it is okay to not provide all the information, as we said. If we are observing for certain behavioral changes or behavioral attributes, or if we are observing for certain reactions which might be influenced if the participants knew what the study was about, then the process may be compromised. So there are exceptions where you don't tell the participant what you're expecting to find. So back to principle 4. So it's the part about voluntariness. The decision to participate must be based on what is involved. So voluntariness is important. It's completely unethical to offer overly enticing rewards for participation, right? So, for example, a vacation in Hawaii, lots of money, minimum reimbursement is fine for whatever the time and effort is. Voluntariness is also obviously affected when the researcher is in a position of power. And I previously cited the example of myself asking my students to participate and knowing who's participating. Okay. Voluntariness, surprisingly, is also affected by how we dress. So, for example, when conducting interviews or handing out surveys, to patients who come to the hospital as a nurse or a physician, it highlights the optics of a power differential. And it's not okay, because think about when you're a patient at a hospital, you're vulnerable, or someone you know is vulnerable, and someone comes up to you with a form to fill, which is part of a research project. It's not likely that most people will refuse. There's no room for voluntariness at that point. Once again, just a reminder that participants are not just free to participate, but also free to withdraw at any time without a reason, and that's important, without providing any reason. It's very frustrating sometimes that a participant who goes through a long 3-hour interview process, hopefully it's not a 3-hour interview, maybe it's a 30-minute interview, but still, perhaps you have acquired that participant through a snowball sampling process and it's been very tedious. It's very frustrating as a researcher, but we cannot ethically pressurize people by shaming them, by guilting them, by threatening, by begging. It's not okay. The fifth principle of research ethics is that research is a public activity. It must be conducted openly. Openly doesn't mean you have to invite people and conduct as theater. The point is, the process needs to be transparent and it needs to be accountable, which means the results of the research should be published, both to the researchers community and to the participants. So in the consent letter, it's often told where the results of this project is available. Research intends to increase our knowledge in some aspect of the universe. That's why it's very public, and that's one of the strengths of knowledge generated by research. This public nature of research keeps researchers honest, and it also protects the public. Now, research teams must also be fully informed to the maximum as to what they are a part of and what the goal of the project is, what their individual roles are and procedures. We cannot keep co-researchers in the dark. It's dangerous and it's inconsiderate. It's a waste of their input, their time. It's completely unethical. Imagine how you'd feel if you were working on a project which you thought was a completely genuine research project and you realized later that you were actually harming people. A research ethics board often tends to be multidisciplinary, having people from different areas of academics. And the reason it does that is because people from different areas of studies and academia have different perspectives on what might be considered ethical. And that's why it tends to be multidisciplinary. Oh, we discussed clothing and interviews previously, and we discussed freedom to withdraw, so we are done there. Okay. So there are other ethical issues in qualitative research that a research ethics board must address. Qualitative research often brings researchers and participants in close contact, and it creates a need for management of interests of both parties. So the researcher must be safe, the participants must be safe. Researchers can help improve the life of participants or others if they have access to certain kinds of data, but they need some support for their efforts. Because participants provide researchers with personal data, they have to be protected from infringement on their privacy. So Research Ethics Board have a lot of other things to think about to support the interests of both parties. Research ethics boards have to think constantly about the changing relationship between the researcher and the participants. Now, if you did end up watching the Stanford Prison Experiment, think about the film, the first day when the students were interviewed versus several days into the experiment itself. Had the relationship changed? What happened to the relationship? So you have to remember that extended contact in some projects compromises the original conditions of approval and the balance of power, especially in terms of authority and trust. So research ethics boards have to be mindful of what could change, and they may have to contact the researcher occasionally to find out what's going on. The other thing research ethics boards have to think about is the comfort and the personal information. They also have to think about counseling support. Often sensitive and painful information might be divulged in an interview process, and the research ethics board has to ask the researcher to come up with potential solutions um, to act as mitigation. Now remember, it's not the research ethics board to deal with um, you know, traumatic remembrance or mental health challenges that may occur. It is the researcher's goal to provide backup support and to also advise the participants appropriately that there's a risk for certain kinds of harm. The research ethics board also has to remember, well, this is more on the researcher. The researcher has to remember that they need consent to quote individuals even when the individuals are not named. The reason for that is simple. People have specific styles of speech, and while there might be no names, a certain phrase or a combination of phrases can be used as an identifier for certain individuals participating in a project. Now, research ethics boards have to also consider experiments or projects that involve observation. Observation requires consent too, and the reason observation requires consent is that if people are being observed where there is an expectation of privacy, then it's unethical to observe, document, and conduct research projects. It's only appropriate that basically it's only appropriate that you get consent from the owner of the facility or from the individuals themselves, letting them know that they might be observed at certain times. While it's not necessary to let them know when they might be observed so that it doesn't influence the experiment, a time range must be provided. Now, secondary data or secondary use of data refers to the idea that a set of data is collected for one project and will be used for another. Even when researching secondary data that has been that's being done with data that was collected through an initial research ethics board application, the research ethics board needs to ensure that the secondary use will not compromise the privacy and confidentiality of the individuals involved, even though the data is already there. Let's say you're working on a project that you collect data from older adults, asking for age ranges and income data to see the correlation of socioeconomic status with the use of a paid facility. So while we have permission to collect that information from the older adults themselves and to collect it from the gym's computer, a second student wants to mine the data we have to correlate with older adults who have chronic disease and use the gym. And while you may already have access to the database because of your initial efforts to do a certain experiment, the second use of it to correlate gym use with chronic disease will require a second round of consent, because now it's a different kind of data that's being observed and potentially exposed, even if it's completely de-identified. Secondary use of anonymized data typically poses no problems, because if the data is anonymized in the first place or de-identified, even when it's used a second time, it continues to remain anonymized. There are some rules for secondary use of data. If the identity is available and it must be published, then it has to be done with permission. identities of people can be, or identifying information you might be able to use when there's little or no risk. When there's any kind of risk, potential risk involved, researchers will have to take appropriate measures to protect both privacy and identity. And researchers must comply with known preferences of individuals for secondary use of their data. Sometimes it can be impossible or impractical to get consent, especially, for example, if a set of data was obtained when a bunch of centenarians were interviewed, or we had a survey conducted with them. If a follow-up secondary experiment was to be done 10 years later, chances are not all of them are alive after 10 years. So consent might be hard to get from the individuals themselves. In those situations, consent might be necessary from family members, or sometimes a research ethics board, based on the nature of what's being done to the data secondarily, might allow it, saying that there's little or no risk. In any case, anytime secondary data is being tapped into which isn't anonymized, it's always a good idea to send the proposal to the research ethics board so that they can look at the data and permit the project to go ahead or make recommendations or modifications. Now we get into a separate topic. This is extensively covered in Chapter 9. The idea is researching with Aboriginal people. CIHR, SSHERC, SHERC, and NSERC have developed ethics guidelines for research about Aboriginal people and with Aboriginal people. There's an entire chapter in the Tri-Council policy statement to its discussion. Aboriginal people have been the quote-unquote subjects for a lot of research projects. Even though research was done on them and with them, it has not benefited them. You have to remember that research has an obligation to benefit the community that it originates from. But research with and from Aboriginal people never benefited them for the longest time. Much of this research was conducted by non-Aboriginal people who have neglected to use methods that appropriately recognize the multiple cultures. Remember, research ethics principle number 1, you have to respect people's cultures, their languages, their religions. All of this was never done. This is an injustice. If we treat the group of people as a homogeneous group with no individualization, is it fair? What happens when you treat people that way? What happens to the relationship? If you stereotype a bunch of people making certain expectations and not look at them as individuals, what happens to your relationship with that group of people? Anyway, as a result of a lot of these experiments and a lot of these practices and projects, there is a lack of trust, particularly of research that appears to have no communal benefit. When working with Aboriginal people, there has to be recognition of the harm that has been done to them by ill-intentioned researchers over the decades, over perhaps the centuries. And there has to be recognition that their unique life and culture and way of life and contribution to Canada is very, very important. So there are several guidelines. The first guideline, and this is all in your textbook, so you can go back and read it at leisure, or unless you have read it already, which I hope you have. The first guideline is to decolonize research, which means decolonizing means to actually use, to include indigenous knowledge, to include their traditions and beliefs and values. The collection of information must adhere to Aboriginal protocols, which means if the Aboriginal people that you're talking to do not wish that you take down notes or you tape record them while speaking to them, that's how it must be. You must commit to memory what's being discussed. You can write your notes later on what your overall impression was of the conversation, but if those are the rules, then those are the rules. Uh, Research must involve elders and Aboriginal researchers because Aboriginal researchers might have a different way of knowing. The research must involve partnerships at all stages of research design. If you're working with Aboriginal participants or Aboriginal researchers, you need to talk to Aboriginal researchers about the research design. Is this the right way to ask the question? Is this the right question to ask? Will this question give me this kind of information? All of these things. Aboriginal methodologies must be used as appropriate. So, for example, if there's a certain practice that you must do prior to asking a certain type of question, that's what you must do. Practices must incorporate their unique worldview and their interconnection between humans and nature. This is not for us to poo-poo their belief of how the world works. And it must include an obligation to intergenerationally transfer knowledge, which means there must be a way for them to be able to communicate this knowledge to their children and grandchildren. Since we acknowledge that research must benefit a community, we have to understand why this is particularly important for Aboriginal people. There have been several abuses from research on Aboriginal people. Sacred songs have been stolen. Their stories have been published for money. Their artifacts have been taken or stolen and distributed. Their knowledge has been devalued as primitive. There have been violation of community norms by studying human remains or human tissues. And obviously there's a failure to share the data of benefits and dissemination of information that has stigmatized entire communities. And this has happened because of a lack of transparency as to what was going to happen with the research and how the information would be disseminated and how the research is being written up. Yep, typo here. Equitable treatment of Aboriginal researchers can happen only if grant panels and funding panels have Aboriginal members, because then they can determine the merit and benefit of an application that does not fit traditional North American or Western guidelines, and it takes an Aboriginal point of view. Aboriginal researchers with or without traditional qualifications, that means without a master's or a PhD from a university, they must be identified in research projects because indeed they are knowledge creators in their community. The community must be engaged and must be trained in research methods as well, both their methods and perhaps if they consent to a Western method of collecting and using data, so that they also benefit from it. For Aboriginal people to recognize their own self-worth and rights, and for them to help forward, researchers must collaborate with them to collect data, or to design experiments, or to mentor them as thesis students. If that's not possible, then any research with Aboriginal populations, individuals from the community must be hired as assistants or translators in any way that they can participate in the research project to benefit their communities. Several communities in Canada have adopted their own ethics code based on consultations around First Nations, their regional longitudinal health survey. The idea is that knowledge is shared and the community owns the data, and it's been done in their lands and using their population. All the research councils have advisory bodies that oversee research about Aboriginal people, and the idea in all of these situations is the partnership has to be genuine. Aboriginal scholars must be given an opportunity to be able to participate and contribute to the research, and then it's the community, Aboriginal community, that owns the research. The idea of Gus Van Ta is we move forward together. So in practice, the idea is that Aboriginal communities are involved in all aspects of the research itself. So Gus Van Ta refers to the Aboriginal way of knowing. It's also referred to as the two-row wampum. It's a treaty to express the rightful relationship between the First Nations and European nations. The relationship between Western knowledge and the Aboriginal way of knowing should be treated as equal when working with Aboriginal people. If we do not have the Aboriginal way of knowing, that's fine. That's why you have Aboriginal partners to help and guide the research process. Finally, the joint exploration must lead to the creation of opportunities as well for further research. Okay? So all of these 7 guidelines of researching with Aboriginal people must be adhered to. Formal negotiation with band councils and the chief is typically required, and consent must always be obtained. Written consent may not be an option, as it might be seen as though we are legalizing something the Western way. So in that case, an oral consent will have to do. Always remember that as a Western researcher, we are guests in the host community, so we have to be respectful and follow their rules. So that's pretty much all we need to talk about research here. Go back to the chapter if you have any questions, read through thoroughly. And then, of course, well, we spoke about integrity, we spoke about consent, verbal consent. Once consent is provided, we work with Aboriginal partners, and ownership is of the band itself. And the guidelines on researchers is we are guests and we have to be respectful. Finally, once the project is over, the ethical component, because we aren't at the stage where we have discussed how we wrap up data and do the analysis, is still in phase 1. But from the ethics perspective, what is important when we end a project? We make the information public. And this could be in the form of a thesis that's in a public library. This could be as a research publication. This could be as a report. This could be as a presentation at a conference, and so on. And then finally, it's a good idea to inform the Research Ethics Board that the project is concluded. Okay, so that's pretty much it for research ethics. As always, answer the questions at the back of your textbook, go through the chapter a second time if you need to, and complete any assignments that you have in the study guide, which might involve either a discussion or an assignment based on the module. Okay, and we will see you at lecture 10. Thank you. Have a good day.